The summer of 2015 in Louisiana had unfolded with a relentless heat and a sticky humidity that clung to everything. Tamika Lavelle had driven her old pickup truck slowly along the dusty road that wound toward the Angola Maximum Security Prison. In the rearview mirror, flashes of gray concrete walls topped with coils of barbed wire had flickered past, a stark reminder of the world she was leaving behind. Beside her, on the passenger seat, sat her husband Jermaine, silent and still, released just hours earlier after 12 long years behind bars. His face, once marked by an easy, open smile that could light up a room, had been etched with deep lines, the kind that spoke of time and hardship rather than age alone. His eyes, once warm and full of life, had carried a hollow emptiness, as though the years had stripped away something essential, leaving a shell where a soul once thrived. Tamika's mind had drifted back to their final moments before his sentencing, a memory as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. She recalled the stifling courtroom in New Orleans, the air thick with the mingled scents of sweat and aged wood, the creak of the benches as she sat rigid, watching Jermaine's shoulders slump under the weight of the judge's words. His hands had trembled slightly as he turned to look at her one last time before they led him away, and in that fleeting glance, she had made a silent vow to wait for him, no matter how long it took. Now, after more than a decade, he had returned to her. The drive had been quiet, the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of loose gravel beneath the tires filling the space where words might have been. Jermaine had stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the blurred landscape of scrubby fields and distant trees, offering no hint of what churned beneath his silence. Tamika had kept her hand steady on the wheel, her fingers tightening now and then as she stole glances at him, searching for traces of the man she had married. Their small house in Baton Rouge had come into view as the road dipped toward a swampy lowland, its weathered frame nestled among towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The place had stood as a testament to time's slow grind, its sagging porch leaned precariously to one side, and the once bright paint had peeled away in curling strips, exposing the wood beneath to the elements. The yard had stretched out in a haphazard sprawl, dotted with relics of a life interrupted, a rusted bicycle half buried in the dirt, an overgrown vegetable patch choked with weeds, and an old kayak propped against the side of a leaning shed, its hull faded from years of neglect. As the truck had rolled to a stop, kicking up a faint cloud of dust, Clarissa DuPont had waited on the porch steps, her familiar figure a steady presence in Tamika's world. Clarissa, a neighbor who had become more like family over the years, had stood with her arms crossed, a cheap cigarette dangling from her lips. The faint smell of tobacco had drifted toward them as she exhaled, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with the quiet curiosity that defined her. She had been there through it all, bringing gossip from town, sharing coffee on lonely mornings, and offering a kind of unspoken solidarity that had kept Tamika tethered during the hardest stretches. Jermaine had climbed out of the truck with deliberate slowness, his boots crunching against the dry earth as he paused to survey the yard. His gaze had lingered on the rusted bike, perhaps recalling the days when it had been new, then shifted to the tangled garden where Tamika had once coaxed tomatoes and okra from the soil. The kayak had caught his eye last, a silent monument to the fishing trips they used to take along the bayou, back when life had been simpler, before the night that changed everything. He had stood there for a long moment, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket, taking in the fragments of a past that had slipped away while he was gone. Tamika had watched him from the driver's seat, her chest tightening with a mix of hope and uncertainty, wondering if the man who stepped back into her life could ever reclaim the pieces of the one who had left it. The first night back home had settled over the small house like a heavy, oppressive shroud. Tamika had stood at the stove, the sizzle of catfish frying in the skillet mingling with the soft clatter of her spoon against the pot of cornmeal mush, a dish Jermaine had once savored with relish in the days before prison claimed him. The kitchen had filled with the familiar aroma of oil and spices, a scent that used to draw him in with a grin, but when she had set the plate before him at the rickety dining table, he had barely lifted his fork. His eyes had remained fixed on some invisible point beyond the peeling wallpaper, his untouched meal cooling as the silence stretched taut between them. When the hour had grown late, they had parted without a word, retreating to separate corners of the house. Tamika had slipped into the bedroom, the mattress creaking under her weight as she pulled the thin quilt over herself, while Germaine had taken the sagging couch in the living room. The air there had carried the damp, musty smell of mildew, layered with the faint staleness of old newspapers stacked haphazardly in the corner, a testament to years of neglect. Morning had crept in with the sluggish gray light of dawn, filtering through the grimy windows. Clarissa had arrived shortly after, her knock sharp against the warped doorframe, a chipped mug of coffee in her hand as she stepped inside. Her loud, brassy laugh had cut through the stillness for a fleeting moment, a burst of sound that seemed to bounce off the walls before fading into the heavy quiet. She had settled at the table, her cigarette smoke curling upward in lazy tendrils, but Germaine had already drifted outside. He had planted himself on the edge of the porch, his legs dangling over the side as he stared out at the murky canal that snaked through the lowland beyond the yard. The water had shimmered dully under the hazy sun, its surface broken now and then by the slow, deliberate glide of an alligator, its eyes barely visible above the ripples. His hands, once deft and sure, capable of threading a fishing line or driving a nail with precision, had rested limply in his lap, fingers slack against the frayed fabric of his pants. From the kitchen window, Tamika had watched him, her hands submerged in soapy dishwater as she scrubbed the skillet. Her gaze had traced the lines of his profile, searching for the spark she remembered, the man who had laughed easily and filled their days with purpose, but all she could find was a stranger wearing his skin. As night had fallen again, sleep had eluded her. She had lain awake in the dark, the hum of cicadas outside blending with the relentless churn of her thoughts. Memories of that night 12 years past had clawed their way to the surface, vivid and unbidden. She had been trudging home from a late shift at the diner, her feet aching in her worn sneakers, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt. The alley had loomed ahead, a shortcut she had taken 100 times before, but that night it had turned into a trap. 3 figures had emerged from the shadows, their voices rough with liquor, knives glinting in their hands as they closed in. Germaine had appeared out of nowhere, a blur of motion as he threw himself between her and the threat. One swing of his fist had connected too hard, too fast, a fluke that sent one of the men sprawling, his head cracking against the concrete curb with a sickening thud. Blood had pooled on the pavement, bright and accusing, and in the chaos that followed, Germaine had shouldered the blame to shield her. The guilt had gnawed at her ever since, a constant whisper that she had led him into that moment, that her choice to walk that path had stolen his freedom. Days had slipped by, and Germaine had begun his search for work, a task that carried the weight of desperation. He had risen early, dressing in the only decent shirt he owned, a faded button-up that hung loosely on his frame, and set out with a thin stack of crumpled resumes. He had trudged from one end of Baton Rouge to the other, his boots kicking up dust as he approached auto shops with their greasy bays, warehouses stacked with fishing gear, and dockyards where the tang of the river hung heavy in the air. Each time, the answer had been the same, a quick glance at his record, a shake of the head, a door closed in his face. With every rejection, he had returned home a little more diminished, his shoulders hunching further, his silence growing thicker. Tamika had seen it in the way he sank onto the couch each evening, the way his hands clenched into fists before relaxing into defeat. The house had become a cavern of unspoken things, its walls echoing with the absence of the life they had once shared, and she wondered if the distance between them would ever shrink or if it had settled in for good, as permanent as the damp that seeped into the floorboards. By mid-July, the heat had swelled into an unrelenting force, pressing down on Baton Rouge with a weight that seemed to sap the life from everything it touched. The air had thickened with moisture, carrying the faint, earthy scent of the nearby swamp, and the sun had beaten down mercilessly on the little house at the edge of the lowland. Yet, within its walls, faint signs of life had begun to stir. One morning, Germaine had risen before the dawn, his footsteps quiet against the creaking floorboards as he moved to the kitchen. He had fumbled with the dented coffee pot, the clink of metal against the counter breaking the stillness, and when Tamika had emerged from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes, she had found a steaming mug waiting for her on the table. His movements had carried a shadow of the old sureness she remembered, the way he used to pour coffee with a casual grace, a small ritual from a time when their days had been woven with ease. She had paused in the doorway, watching him shuffle back to the stove, and felt a flicker of something like hope stir in her chest. The days that followed had drawn them closer, tentative threads of connection weaving through the silence that had once dominated. They had spent hours together under the punishing sun, tackling the leaking roof that had plagued the house for years. Germain had climbed the ladder with a hammer in hand, his shirt sticking to his back with sweat as he pried loose the rotting shingles, while Tamika had handed up nails and strips of tar paper from below. Later, they had turned to the canal, wading into its shallow edges with rakes to drag out the choking mats of water hyacinth that had overrun it. The work had been slow and grueling, the mud sucking at their boots, but there had been a rhythm to it, a shared purpose that felt like a bridge over the gulf between them. Evenings had found them on the porch, perched side by side on the weathered steps, the chorus of cicadas rising from the trees as the sky bled into shades of orange and purple. One night, as the humidity had pressed close and the darkness deepened, Germain had shifted in his sleep, his arm curling around her waist. She had lain still, her breath catching as the warmth of his touch seeped into her, and for the first time in months, their closeness had unfolded without the tremor of fear or the weight of hesitation that had haunted him since his return. Clarissa had remained a constant presence, her visits punctuating the days with a burst of energy that softened the house's edges. She had arrived with baskets of ripe peaches from the market, their skins fuzzy and warm from the sun, and plopped them on the kitchen counter alongside tales of the neighbors' latest dramas. The widow down the road who swore her cat spoke to spirits, or the mechanic who had run off with his boss's wife. Her laughter had filled the room, sharp and unrestrained, and her presence had brought a fleeting warmth that lingered even after she left. Germain had taken to tinkering with the old kayak in the shed, dragging it out from its corner where cobwebs had gathered thickly over its hull. He had spent hours sanding down the cracked wood, his hands moving with a focus Tamika hadn't seen in him since before the prison years. She had watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame as he brushed away sawdust, and saw in his careful strokes a whisper of the past, of lazy afternoons on the river, fishing lines cast into the current, dreams of a quiet life unfurling between them. It had felt like a fragile promise, a hint that the man she had lost might still be within reach. But there had been moments when the shadow of his time away crept back in, uninvited and unshakable. He had paused sometimes in the middle of a task, hammer raised mid-swing or rake stilled in the water, his eyes clouding over with a glassy distance that seemed to pull him somewhere far beyond the yard. Tamika had felt it then, a cold certainty that the prison still held him in its grip, its echoes buried deep in the lines of his face and the sudden stillness of his hands. Clarissa had noticed it too, her brow furrowing as she lingered over coffee one morning. She had suggested, with a gentleness unusual for her, that he might find solace with the local pastor, a man known for guiding lost souls back to themselves. But Germain had brushed it off with a flick of his hand, his jaw tightening as he turned away, shutting down any mention of what he had endured. The past had remained a locked door, its key lost somewhere in the years he had spent behind bars, and Tamika had stood on the other side, peering through the cracks, wondering if she would ever find a way to reach him fully. August had arrived with a heat that seemed to bake the earth itself, the air in Baton Rouge growing heavy and still, as if the world held its breath under the relentless sun. Tamika had felt the weight of it in her bones, a persistent weariness that dragged at her steps, coupled with a dry, nagging cough that lingered no matter how much water she drank or how long she rested. She had brushed it off for weeks, blaming the humidity and the long hours she still pulled at the diner to keep the bills paid, but when the fatigue had deepened and the cough had sharpened, she had made her way to the small clinic on the edge of town. Dr. Ruth Thomas had greeted her there, a wiry woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, her hand steady as she took Tamika's vitals in the cramped exam room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old linoleum. The visit had been routine at first, blood drawn, questions answered, the usual hum of a checkup, but when the results had come back days later, they had landed like a thunderclap splitting the quiet of her life. HIV. The word had hung in the air, stark and unyielding, as Dr. Thomas had explained it with a calm that Tamika could barely hear through the ringing in her ears. Her mind had reeled, spinning backward through the months since Germain's return, each memory of his touch, his hands on her skin, his lips brushing hers, now tainted with a creeping dread that twisted her stomach into knots. Fear had surged through her, sharp and cold, but alongside it had come a terrible clarity, a dawning realization that stitched together the fragments of his silences and hesitations into a grim, undeniable truth. She had driven home in a daze, the pickup's engine rumbling beneath her as the road blurred past, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The house had loomed ahead, its sagging silhouette framed by the cypress trees, and when she had stepped inside, the air had felt thick with the weight of what she carried. Germain had been in the kitchen, hunched over a cup of cold coffee, his fingers tracing idle patterns on the chipped tabletop. She had crossed the room without a sound, the papers from the clinic trembling slightly in her grasp as she laid them before him. He had looked up, his eyes meeting the stark black print, and in an instant, his face had crumpled. His body had collapsed to the floor, knees hitting the worn boards with a thud, and he had folded in on himself, his frame shaking with sobs that tore from his chest in ragged gasps. His hands had clawed at the air, then at his own shirt, as if he could rip away the truth, and his voice had broken through the weeping, a low, fractured murmur about the prison, about things he hadn't known, about a desperate need to shield her from a reality he couldn't face himself. He had spoken then, words spilling out in a halting rush, of the violence that had marked his years behind bars, the assaults in the dim corners of cells and showers, the medical checkups where brusque hands had prodded him without explanation, leaving him with nothing but shame that had festered in silence. Each confession had hung between them, heavy and raw, a wound laid bare after years of hiding. Tamika had sunk down beside him, her knees pressing into the floor as she wrapped her arms around his trembling shoulders. His head had bowed against her, and she had felt the warmth of his tears soaking through her shirt, her own falling silently to mingle with his, dripping onto the curve of his neck. The room had seemed to close in around them, the walls bearing witness to a grief too vast to contain, but in that moment she had held him tighter, her fingers threading through his hair as if she could anchor him to her through the storm of it all. Dr. Ruth Thomas had become their lifeline in the days that followed, her steady presence guiding them through the wreckage of the diagnosis. She had sat them down in her office, the hum of an old fan stirring the air, and mapped out a plan, medications to start, appointments to keep, a referral to a counselor who could help them navigate the emotional terrain ahead. She had urged them toward therapy with a quiet insistence, her voice cutting through their stunned silence, and though Germain had hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor, Tamika had nodded, sensing it was a thread they couldn't afford to let slip. They had begun to adapt, step by halting step, to the new reality that now defined their lives. Tamika had taken to poring over articles late into the night, her eyes straining under the dim glow of a lamp as she scoured medical journals and online forums for anything that might offer insight, treatments, side effects, stories of others who had walked this path. The pages had piled up on the kitchen table, scribbled with notes in her careful hand, a lifeline she clung to as she sought to understand what lay ahead. Germain, meanwhile, had returned to the kayak in the shed with a renewed vigor, his hands moving over the wood with a purpose that seemed to defy the weight pressing down on him. He had sanded and patched, the rasp of his tools filling the air with a steady rhythm, and Tamika had watched from the yard, seeing in his focus a flicker of the man who had once found solace on the water, a man grasping at hope, however fragile it might be. Clarissa had kept coming, her visits a quiet constant amid the upheaval. She had arrived with pots of gumbo or plates of cornbread, setting them down without fanfare, her eyes soft with an understanding she didn't voice. She had lingered sometimes, smoking on the porch as the sun dipped low, offering no questions, only the steady presence of someone who knew the value of simply being there. The house had held them all in its creaking embrace, its walls absorbing the shift from despair to a tentative resilience, as they learned, day by day, to live with the truth that had upended everything they thought they had reclaimed. September had slipped into Baton Rouge with a subtle shift in the air, the oppressive heat of summer beginning to loosen its grip, though the humidity still hung thick over the lowland. Germain had woken early one morning, a quiet determination settling over him as he moved through the house with purpose. He had decided to mark their anniversary, 15 years since the night they had first met at a riverside dance, the music of a fiddle and the glow of lanterns lighting up the dark. Through a friend of Clarissa's, a wiry man who worked odd jobs around town, he had heard whispers of a new drug, an experimental treatment not yet cleared for the market but rumored to bolster the immune system in ways their current regimen couldn't. The possibility had sparked something in him, a glimmer of the man who once dreamed of a future unshadowed by the past, and he had resolved to make it a surprise, a gift to Tamika that might lighten the burden they carried. He had taken the keys to the pickup, the engine coughing to life as he backed out of the yard, and set off for Lafayette, a town some 40 miles west, promising to be back by dusk. Tamika had stood on the porch, her arms crossed against the morning chill, watching as the truck's taillights faded into a cloud of dust that lingered on the road long after he had gone. She had felt a pang of unease, a fleeting shadow across her heart, but had shaken it off, trusting in the steadiness she had seen in him lately. The day had stretched out slowly, each hour dragging under the weight of a sky that hung low and gray. Clarissa had stopped by in the afternoon, her boots scuffing the steps as she climbed onto the porch with a thermos of tea and a handful of town gossip to share. She had lingered for a while, her cigarette smoke curling into the damp air as she recounted tales of a fisherman who swore he'd seen a ghost on the bayou, but her usual chatter had done little to fill the quiet that settled over Tamika. As evening had deepened into night, that unease had tightened into a cold knot in her chest. Germain's phone had gone silent, each call she made met with the hollow drone of voicemail. She had paced the house, her footsteps echoing against the floorboards, checking the clock as the minutes ticked into hours, her mind spinning with possibilities she refused to name. Sleep had evaded her, the darkness outside pressing against the windows, until the phone had finally rung at dawn, its shrill tone cutting through the stillness. The voice on the other end, a weary officer from the parish sheriff's department, had delivered the news, a body found in an abandoned shed by the river, just off a lonely stretch of highway. The pickup had been parked nearby, its engine cold, a small paper bag containing vials of the unapproved drug resting on the passenger seat, untouched. Tamika had driven to the scene with Clarissa beside her, the road unfolding in a blur of green and brown as the cypress trees loomed like sentinels along the water's edge. The shed had stood dilapidated and rotting, its tin roof caved in on one side, surrounded by deputies who moved with grim efficiency. The coroner had arrived shortly after, a stooped man with a clipboard, and his examination had confirmed the worst. Germain had been brutalized, evidence of sexual assault preceding a savage killing, the wounds bearing the deliberate, practiced marks of someone familiar with the violence of prison life. Tamika had stood at a distance, her hands clenched into fists, as the weight of it settled over her, a grief too vast to grasp. Detective Eli Thompson, a lean figure with tired eyes who had worked Germain's case 12 years before, had taken over the investigation. He had dug through old files, his memory jogged by the echoes of that night in the alley, and unearthed a name, Leroy Baxter, a man who had shared a cell block with Germain during his sentence. Leroy had been the father of the boy who died that night, the one whose skull had cracked against the curb in a moment of chaos, and he had walked free from prison 3 months earlier, his parole papers still fresh. The pieces had fallen into place with a chilling precision. Leroy had tracked Germain down, his vengeance festering through years of confinement, and struck with a cruelty that mirrored the torment he had once inflicted behind bars. Tamika had returned home alone, the house swallowing her in its silence as Clarissa lingered outside, unwilling to leave but unsure of how to stay. The truth had hollowed her out, leaving her motionless in the kitchen, her gaze fixed on the empty chair where Germain had sat just days before. Her eyes had grown vacant, a blankness settling over her features as if the life had drained from them, and she had moved through the hours like a ghost, untouched by the world around her. Night had fallen, the cicadas' drone rising to fill the void, when she had slipped out, leaving the door ajar and the lights unlit. She had taken the pickup, its engine rumbling faintly as she disappeared into the dark, her destination known only to her. At dawn, Eli had followed a hunch, driving to a rundown trailer park on the outskirts of town where Leroy had holed up since his release. He had found the door splintered open, the air inside thick with the coppery tang of blood. Leroy had lain sprawled across the floor, his body pierced repeatedly with a blade, the wounds deep and frenzied, a testament to a rage that left no room for mercy. Eli had stood over the scene, his flashlight cutting through the gloom, and known without doubt that Tamika had been there, her grief turned to a vengeance as brutal as the one that had taken Germain from her. Eli had tracked Tamika down to the riverbank where she and Jermaine had once spent countless afternoons, their lines cast into the sluggish current, the quiet broken only by the splash of fish and their shared laughter. He had arrived as the first light of morning crept over the horizon, painting the water in shades of gold and amber that danced across its murky surface. She had been there, seated on a patch of damp earth near the water's edge, her legs folded beneath her, Jermaine's old fishing rod clutched in her hands like a relic. The wood of the pole had been worn smooth by years of use, its reel rusted but still intact, a silent witness to the life they had built before it all unraveled. Her clothes had been streaked with mud, the hem of her skirt darkened by the riverbank silt, and splotches of dried blood had crusted across her sleeves and hands, a stark testament to the night she had endured. She had looked up as Eli approached, her eyes meeting his with a calm that belied the storm within her, and she had begun to recount what she had done. Her voice had been soft, steady, as she described how she had hunted Leroy down, following him to his trailer under the cover of darkness, her steps silent against the gravel until she had stood before him. She had spoken of each scream he had let out as she struck, the sound ringing in her ears like a bomb, soothing the raw ache of losing Jermaine. Revenge had become her final offering to him, a brutal act of love carved out in the stillness of the night, and she had felt no remorse, only a strange, hollow peace settling over her as the deed was done. Eli had listened without moving, his boots planted in the soft ground as she continued, her words threading through the morning air like a confession to the river itself. She had paused then, her gaze dropping to the rod in her lap, and revealed a truth that had caught him off guard. She was carrying Jermaine's child, a secret she had meant to share with him on their anniversary, a flicker of life he would never know. Her hands had tightened around the fishing pole, her knuckles whitening as she stared out at the water, where the sun's reflection shimmered like a broken promise. Eli had eased himself down beside her, the damp earth cool against his legs as he settled into the silence that followed. He had pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen for a moment before he dialed his partner, a younger deputy named Carter who had been at the trailer with him earlier. His instructions had been curt: wipe down the scene, dispose of the knife, scatter enough clutter to suggest a botched robbery, anything to erase the trail that led back to Tamika. He had ended the call and slipped the phone away, his eyes fixed on the river as it flowed past, carrying with it the faint ripple of their decision. They had remained there through the day, side by side, the hours stretching out in a quiet unbroken by words. The air had grown thick with the scent of the swamp, wet earth, decaying leaves, the sharp tang of brackish water, and the distant cries of herons had pierced the stillness as the sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent toward the horizon. As dusk had approached, the sky had turned a deep, bruised purple, the light fading into shadows that stretched long across the bank. Eli had risen stiffly, his joints protesting after hours on the ground, and offered Tamika a hand. She had taken it, her grip firm but trembling faintly, and they had made their way back to the house in silence, the pickup's headlights cutting through the gathering dark. Clarissa had been waiting on the porch, her silhouette framed by the glow of a single bulb above the door, a tray with a steaming pot of tea and a bottle of bourbon balanced in her hands. She had stepped inside without a glance at the blood on Tamika's clothes, setting the tray on the kitchen table with a clatter that seemed too loud in the quiet. They had sat together, the three of them, the tea growing cold in their cups as they turned to the bourbon instead. The first sip had burned down Eli's throat, the second had dulled the edges of the day, and by the third, the room had begun to sway, the walls tilting as the liquor blurred their grief into something softer, less sharp. Tamika had leaned against the table, her head resting on her arms, while Clarissa had kept the glasses filled, her movements slow and deliberate. The night had slipped away in that haze, the hours melting into one another until the first gray of dawn had crept through the windows, casting faint light across the floor. Eli had stirred as the morning took hold, his head heavy and his mouth dry from the bourbon's aftertaste. He had pulled himself upright, smoothing the wrinkles from his shirt as he stepped outside, leaving Tamika curled on the couch where she had finally drifted off. The case file on Leroy had waited for him at the station, and he had driven there with the taste of the river still lingering in his mind. He had sat at his desk, the hum of the precinct buzzing around him, and typed up the report: unknown assailant, no witnesses, signs of a struggle pointing to a random attack gone wrong. He had submitted it without hesitation, closing the book on a crime he knew would never see justice in the traditional sense, and left the station as the sun climbed higher. Tamika had returned to the riverbank later that day, drawn back to the spot where the water lapped gently against the shore. She had stood there alone, her eyes tracing the current where they had once fished together, the ghosts of their past flickering in the ripples. The house had remained empty behind her, its silence now complete, and she had stayed by the river as the light faded, the shadows of what they had been stretching out to meet the quiet that remained.